All right, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. This is Rich, Spike, and John for the Coastal Crisis Chaplaincy. And today we want to talk a little bit about tele chaplaincy, virtual chaplaincy, whatever you want to call it. So many of us are wired to be there in person, to be on the scene. We have a whole process we sort of go through in becoming physically present, whether it be our drive time and our prayer time and our preparation. Now everything for the time being is on the phone, and sometimes there are things that you don't always think about, and sometimes when you're on a scene there's a lot happening that can sort of prompt you or just give you the opportunity to be present, but it's a very different dynamic on the phone. And a lot of us have been talking about it and asking questions and trying to figure out, hey, how can we best do what we do as virtual chaplaincy, or maybe telechaplaincy, whatever you want to call it. There's nothing virtual about what we're doing. It's vital. But I think it's the medium that we're doing it through that we want to make sure that we sort of eliminate the barriers and make the best of it. So today we figured we would grab veteran Chaplain Spike and Dr. Pritchett, and we're going to let everyone introduce themselves, and then we'll just sort of jump into the topic. So Spike, I'll let you introduce yourself, and then if you want to introduce our guest today.
My name is Spike Coleman. I have served as a chaplain with Coastal Crisis Chaplaincy for close to 10 years, and I'm also a pastor here in Charleston at St. Andrew's Presbyterian. I've been at St. Andrew's for 22 and a half years, and I'm grateful to serve. And I'm also grateful to share this time with my friend John Pritchett. John and I have known one another for a number of years, and we have had numerous conversations over the years that have been a blessing and very insightful for me. So I'm grateful to be with John today.
Yeah, well, thank you, Spike. I'm glad to be with you all and hope this can help with the great work you all do with intense, tough situations. And just as a way of intro for me, I have practiced psychiatry for a number of years. I moved to Charleston in 1992 and have practiced psychiatry here since then. Currently, I'm at the VA working with veterans. And whenever I do any kind of speaking or anything, I have to clarify that I'm not speaking for the federal government or speaking for the VA, but I'm just speaking as my individual thoughts about something. So what I'm doing currently is working in the telemedicine field. And so hopefully, some of the things that we've learned or I've learned with working in that area could be of help to you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, we're looking forward to sort of jumping into this conversation. I think we're good with silence as chaplains, but usually that's on a scene where you can see body language. Sometimes now in this time with the pandemic, we may be on FaceTime or something like that. And great, that's helpful. We can see some body language. But more and more, it seems that just talking on the phone is going to be how we're connecting with people. So it's a different dynamic because you lose a lot of the input and the feedback that you would have with physical presence. And people can rush you off the phone quick, or you can be in spots where you're not really sure how to move the conversation, or maybe the conversation doesn't need to be moved and they just need to know there's someone on the other end. But there are a lot of questions, and all of us are trying to figure this out and figure out what it looks like. We've been talking on the phone all our lives, but it's a little different when you're dealing with someone who's just lost a loved one to a homicide or a suicide or some other traumatic event, or maybe it's the following days that you're interacting. So why don't we just start with basics? What would you say, how do you prepare yourself before you start a call? Or what's sort of your routine? What would you recommend that might work for us?
Sure. Well, definitely before a contact, you want to have the preparation that you typically would. Your preparation should be the same for this as it would be for a face-to-face contact, with trying to get the information that you can from different sources. And I guess now, instead of face-to-face contact, you'll be receiving information from other sources over the telephone or other media. So you have that. You feel like you're walking into it with the same type of preparation you would typically, and you also want to be prepared as you walk in for what if this encounter needs to have some follow-up urgently.
Mm.
And that way, when you walk in, you're not surprised if that comes up, because you've got a plan and you've got a sense of that already about how you would respond, depending on a variety of scenarios that might come up. And so I think that's really helpful on the front end, to walk in with that understanding. And so what I typically do on a first encounter or on a subsequent encounter, usually these days I'm explaining that things are different right now because of the virus, and that this contact and communication is by phone because of that, and people are very understanding of that. And then I ask them if they have a place that's private that they can talk, not assuming that they are in a private spot, and see kind of where they're at with that, if they need to move to a different area. And then I try to also verify that our technology and our different aspects of sound and vision are okay. Can you hear me? Can you see me? All those things. So we start with those kind of checks, and whatever troubleshooting we need to do in that regard. I think it's probably a good idea too to talk about if we get disconnected, because phone calls get dropped and things like that. Clarify, if we get disconnected, I'm going to be making efforts to call you back or to reach you back, so they know that. And then the next thing is I go ahead and set the scene with the interaction that we need to prepare for the possibility of an emergency. And I just say, what I usually say is, as a matter of housekeeping, before we get started, one of the things we do is we want to check in case there were an emergency. We'd like to know your physical location and where you are. And people are generally very receptive to that. I think it's a good idea to, in addition to getting their address, to get their zip code in case you needed to provide that information. And so I would try to get that. And then also to tell the person, we also would like to get an emergency contact, someone we could call if there were an emergency from your friends or family that you trust. That could be an emergency contact person for you. And people generally understand that idea too. They get that. And so I try to go ahead and document that before we start, and that way we've got that info. And then go ahead. A common way that, my interactions are starting is, how have you been doing with all this, with the virus, and how you've been doing in general? That's kind of with my work, how it's starting. Now with you all, you're going to have a different frame. You're stepping in with as you get started, but then you're shifting pretty quickly to what your typical interaction would be after you do these things in the beginning, and then you're shifting.
That's great. That's really helpful in just sort of giving you a sense of upfront things to set up. Spike, what would you say, like from a chaplain's perspective, what are those first sort of few moments of a phone call? What information stands out to you as important to gather? or self-preparation, like we're just hearing about location, that kind of thing? What's your thought on that?
Well, John did an excellent job of laying out some basics. These things would actually be a good checklist that we could have as a form that we fill out. Say when we call someone, have that form ready. So we're writing all these things down. And if we have a set form, we're not likely to forget something.
Yeah.
But also room to add something as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that to be prepared for that, I think recognizing that as we engage scenes on the phone is very different than going. And recognizing in us, that's going to create some dissonance. We're going to need to be aware of our own feelings, our own frustrations, and not project them onto the person we're interacting with, because we are trained to go. And part of that entails preparation, having our clothing ready, having everything packed in the car, our identifications and things like that. So when the phone rings, we're ready. And so with this, we have a different checklist, a different go bag, to speak. And how we prepare and how we pray and calm ourselves so we're ready to engage that person makes a difference. Recently, I had a scene that I responded to after the fact that involved Spanish speakers. So one of the things I did is that I had a Spanish language prayer book. And so I turned to that for prayers that might be appropriate for a situation like this. And that was enormously helpful. So that was one thing I took a few minutes to do that before I made the call. And then of course my own prayers before I do that. I think one of the things as we make that call, first we'll be with a scene supervisor, and some of this information they can give us perhaps. Often on scenes I get the information from the coroner or one of the first responders before I interact with the people. But I think it's still a good question to ask the people we interact with. It's a way of building trust and rapport. But I've also been in situations where when I ask someone their name, because they were so traumatized and so distraught, they weren't capable of telling me their name.
Yeah.
And so how do you interact with them to try to calm them down? What tools do you have to get them to a point, help them get to a place where they can? And some of that, when we're on the scene, is our body language, our tone of voice, them being able to see us and recognizing it's different when you're on the phone. Now, perhaps FaceTime or WhatsApp, those have video call features, could be helpful. But also just recognizing our breathing, our tone of voice and our pace as we talk could help calm someone down over time so that they could answer those questions and provide that information that we need. And then, letting them know, as John said, that if we get disconnected, which happens a lot, know that we will try to call you, we will call you back. And that could go a long ways in building trust and rapport as well. And then beginning with open-ended questions to let them tell you where they are, not just physically, geographically, but emotionally and spiritually. What has happened and where are they in processing that? Let them tell their story.
I think that's great. And one of course, the challenges is in talking with folks and trying to get like an alternate contact number. A lot of times we have the experience we're on scene and they're hitting their phone. They can't even focus their eyes. They can't focus cognitively. So asking for a phone number may be a challenge. So I guess there are probably ways that, what would you suggest, Spike? Would you ask the person maybe to hand the phone briefly to someone who's with them and then through that maybe get some contact information? I'm assuming if the person can't really navigate it, or what around.
It depends on if they're alone or not, because I've been on scenes where a friend or family member has given me a contact for someone else.
Okay.
If you asked me my mother's cell phone number, I couldn't tell you because yeah, I don't read her number.
Yeah.
So when if I'm on the phone talking, I'm going to have to hang up to look up my mom's number and then call you back.
Yeah.
So if they have friends with them, they might have, say, their relatives or friends or emergency contacts number. So they
Sure.
may have a friend that can give it to
Yeah.
you, or perhaps the scene supervisor may have that information as well.
Excellent. Excellent. That's great. Different ways to try and maybe get the contact numbers, the follow-ups, the emergency contact,
Right.
or to find out what kind of social support is in place.
Right. And I think that's the big thing, to help them connect with their social support, and also to let them know that we will follow up with them as well. You know, a lot of times on scenes, we can be with them for hours.
Yeah.
In this situation, that's really probably not going to happen. And so part of what we're doing is building rapport so we can engage in a process that's going to unfold over time. That involves perhaps us following up, but also perhaps our follow-up group doing that as well.
Yeah, that's great. That's really good. Dr. Pritchard, what would you suggest would be a good way for someone to sort of introduce themselves, explain their role, and sort of set up expectations for the call and how long it might be, or that kind of thing? Of course, if we're talking with someone who's just experienced traumatic loss, it could be a very short phone call. It may be that they want us to stay on the phone with them for hours. But as far as, just in the context maybe of follow-up calls or what kind of expectations would we set up? How might we best explain our function and our role for them in that moment or going forward?
Yeah, and it sounds like this is going to be a transition for you all from what your typical patterns have been. And so, do you think that you would probably be having a dialogue with the person about that, about kind of what their needs are and what they, and not maybe not from the initial get-go, but as the conversation evolves and the ministry contact evolves, kind of seeing where they're at with that in an interactive kind of way.
Yeah.
To me, because it sounds like it's going to be for you all an unfolding of what this is going to look like over time, and in some ways, the folks you're ministering to are going to be helping guide that with this new medium and new way of doing it.
Yeah, I think so, and it seems like there are some core things that we want to make sure we accomplish or find out, as we're mentioning about social support, or like you were mentioning about safety and some of the basic things, psychological first aid kinds of stuff. But there may be some folks who don't want to talk, and there may be some who do, and there may be some who just want us to sit on the phone with them to know that there's someone there, or call back, or
Absolutely. How do you all, Rich, typically handle the concept of checking in about safety with folks when you meet with them, and suicidal, homicidal thoughts, those kind of things?
Sure. So obviously, if we're on scene, there's a lot of looking around and there's a lot of checking in, and you have the whole, you can visually see a lot of things. But of course, on the phone, that would be very different. So I would think it just has to do with questions about how are people feeling safe, and letting some of these things come out conversationally. We don't typically do, say, there's no real inpatient assessment or anything at the beginning of our interactions. It's more sort of coming alongside them and talking through it. So we tend to, and I'll let Spike chime in on this as well. If it's something with suicidal ideation, usually there's a prompt or there's something that will make us delve into that a little more. Some of the statements about hope but I think it's a fine line. Spike, if you want to speak to that, because I think most of our survivors, we all have that experience that they don't know what the next step is. They say, I don't know how I can go. They make these statements that aren't necessarily suicidal ideation, but they might sound like it because they just can't see beyond their feet. Spike, would you chime in on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think.
And then be great to hear. Mm-hmm.
Sure. It's rare that I've been on scenes that I've heard someone say things to suggest that they were contemplating suicide. It's more likely that they are, as you mentioned, they don't know what comes next. They don't know, if they've lost a spouse and, how do they manage their household? Those kinds of things. How do they go on with the loss of a child or someone that was very close to them? It's those kinds of things, just the distraught nature that their world has changed forever. And it's way beyond their control and they can't see tomorrow yet. And so those kinds of things, if they are expressing some kind of suicidal ideation, at that point, we need to be in contact with the scene supervisor if they're still on scene and have more or less a process ready if we need to call 911 as emergency, if it dictates that, or mobile crisis. There are different resources that we have that we need to be aware of. So to be aware of those kinds of things. And one of the things on scenes in terms of health, some just very practical things, it's really hot here in the summer. So, we often offer water, or a lot of people in our community have diabetes. So I keep peanut butter crackers in my car, just because people's blood sugar can drop in those kinds of situations. And so just those practical things and assessing their needs, just very practical things. How are you feeling? Not that we're trying to diagnose them, but just we don't have the cues that we might, if they're not sweating or feeling a little tingly, we're not going to be able to see that over the phone necessarily. But if we hear something in their voice, perhaps, we can respond, just open-ended questions to see how they're feeling and if they're okay. And then perhaps the scene supervisor or someone on the scene can assess them, if we can make that connection. So it's really about making connections.
Mm-hmm. I think so. And obviously, if we sense something and there is some kind of statement, we're going to alert mobile crisis or EMS. We're going to immediately, as mandated reporter, hand them off into the appropriate care. But right. I'll also go as far as to say, if we just had that inkling that maybe we just need to ask before we get off the phone. Right. I think sometimes folks are used to lists of questions, and it's probably okay to say in a loving, caring way, hey, if you don't mind, it's been, I hope this has been a helpful conversation, but I do need to just get a few basic informational questions asked, or like John was saying, some housekeeping questions, and then make that one of those questions in there. Do you have social supports, so on and so forth, and contact number. Of course, you're probably getting that up front, but at the end of the call, you could confirm some of that, and then you could just ask, are you having any thoughts of ending your life, or that, however you might ask your suicide question, obviously directly, but doing it in a list that seems almost procedural. Or because certainly if you sensed that was an issue, you'd be asking it in a very concerned and caring manner earlier. Right. So, but I think there's always a way to sort of approach that and ask that. But Dr. Pritchett, I'd love to hear your thoughts on when we're on a call with someone and maybe it becomes emergent and maybe their emotions are becoming overwhelming and you're sort of trying to figure out what to do, or you sense there's an emergency, or there's suicidal ideation, or maybe the person becomes so emotional and you're worried and then they hang up the phone. How would you handle some of those ways that we can be interacting and suddenly it's feels like it's out of control when you're on the phone?
Yeah, and that's really where ahead of time, again, you want to have a sense of what your protocol is before you even start the phone call, so that if that happens, you already have a pretty clear sense of step A, step B.
Mm-hmm.
Um, one way, I mean, it strikes me that you all are encountering people who have very recently encountered how unsafe life can be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe a good frame to put this discussion in would be, hey, I just want to check in with you about safety.
Mm.
Let's check in about safety. Are you doing okay?
Yeah, yeah.
Have you had any thoughts about hurting yourself
Mm-hmm.
or anybody else? And kind of just as a frame, a very natural way to talk about safety, and that safety includes them too.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's a part of the conversation. And then
Mm-hmm.
the spectrum of suicidal thoughts, as I think about it, runs from feeling weary
Mm-hmm.
to really feeling like if the Lord took me right now, that would be okay with me.
Mm-hmm.
If life were over now, that would be all right. To kind of the next step in the spectrum would be, maybe I'm actually thinking about some things I would do to make that happen.
Mm-hmm.
To then thinking about some specifics of how that might happen, what I might actually do.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually moving toward the intent of actually putting that in place,
Mm-hmm.
and actually moving from contemplation toward thinking about action. That would be kind of the spectrum
Mm-hmm.
that runs across. And you get much more concerned when it moves from the idea of if life were over, that would be okay, when it moves from that to, yes, actually, I've been thinking about methods
Mm-hmm.
that I would use to have that happen. And if you're picking up on that, I think the number one thing you want to think about is keep that person on the phone.
Mm.
You want to maintain connection with that person. And just an immediate natural follow-up to that would be, can I check in with you about the safety of your environment?
Mm.
Is it safe where you are? Is there a gun there?
Mm-hmm.
Is there rope there? Are there large amounts of, things like opioids or medications that would be particularly dangerous? And that can be a very natural follow-up,
Mm-hmm.
talking about safety, and just continue framing it in that frame of safety. And so that can be, again, a conversation that follows naturally.
Mm-hmm.
You also want to, as you're thinking about safety, include their environment. A part of the safety of their environment also is who's there for you. Are you alone? Are you with somebody? Who can we get connected with you now? And one of the things that I think would be valuable for you all is to have the availability of a second telephone.
Mm. Okay.
As you enter into these interactions. So let's say you really want to keep the person on the phone, and however you want to try to reach the people that are on site, or you want to try to reach mobile crisis or 911, to go ahead and have the availability of another line you could use for that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people are pretty comfortable with, hey, I'm going to make another call here. I'm concerned. I want to try. Let's get you some support. Let's get you some connection. And you can even make that call with the person, still connected with you, and say, I'm connected with Jim, and he's here with me. We're on the phone,
Mm-hmm.
Here's the location, and this is the concern we have, and you can walk through that with them there. Or I think that's probably the best, rather than muting the call and disconnecting from them for that period of time.
And of course, we can text to 911 now, so that's a huge help, being able to communicate that way.
Yes, so that, having a good familiarity with that would be excellent.
Yeah.
There's also,
mm-hmm.
I was just going to say, in terms of the zip code, if you are, do you ever interact with folks who are not in this immediate area, who are kind of a little bit out from Charleston?
At times we do, when we're talking with family of a survivor, or maybe the other sibling or that kind of thing, and that would be over the phone, and then we're usually on scene with the survivor. But I think there's certainly more opportunity for that now.
And that's where getting that zip code is helpful. If you can kind of find out, there is a service. Have you all heard of E911?
Yeah.
So if you have an emergency situation and it's anywhere in the country, you can contact E911 and give them the zip code and the location and the situation, and they will go ahead and mobilize 911 wherever that is in the country. Folks.
Yeah. So all of this really shows how important some of those information questions up front are. And sometimes, if it's after the fact, obviously if they're on scene, you're trusting in the first responders to ensure that safety. But it would be normal when you're calling the next day to ask some of those basic questions and to say, hey, I'd like, before we get into some conversation, just have some basic questions about your safety. And I think people will experience that as caring concern. But at the same time, it starts a little bit of conversational process, a call and response, a pattern of conversing that people start to develop a little bit of rapport. So by the time you're done with your basics, you can then start asking those open-ended questions. I'd just be curious, Dr. Pritchard, what would you say would be some good open-ended questions that could sort of open up the conversation to touch base on some of those areas that we want to be aware of or help them through? Sometimes it can be awkward on the phone with someone. Sometimes you're not sure what to say. And we always try and avoid the closed-ended questions because that's sort of meeting our need to control the conversation. But what would you suggest that sort of opens things up? Anything that you find helpful?
Yeah. Well, again, you're dealing with folks who have been through, some of the scariest, most difficult, terrifying times in their lives. And so I think, again, a natural segue is safety. And how are you doing with this? Are you feeling overwhelmed by this? Are you feeling safe with the feeling?
John, your internet froze for a minute. See if he comes back. Spike, while we're waiting on his internet to come back, do you want to, what do you find helpful with open-ended questions on your end?
Yes, I think the safety and well-being as well, just overall well-being, are an excellent way to start. And that could be practical things like, are you in a situation where you have enough food to eat, plenty of water to drink, just to take care of your basic needs? And then that transitions to some of the more delicate questions about safety. And so you're building rapport, but also checking on their well-being as you do that. So I think John's right. That's an excellent way of doing it. And letting them know you care. And those are things, as we talk about safety, I think of scenes where we're out in a situation where we're often either in the street or beside the street. And so part of their safety questions is, okay, get out of the road. Yeah, and so I can't help but think of that just because of my experience. But you do have to trust the first responders. But a lot of times they're really busy processing the scene.
Yeah.
And so that does fall to the chaplains to keep people out of the street. And so, but I think overall well-being, questions about their well-being, about food, water, social support can lead to the questions that John mentioned about how they feel, being where they are. Do they have somebody with them? Can we help facilitate that? And then also suicide being one of those questions. We can talk about their background as well. And as they tell stories, that'll get a sense as we listen to them tell stories about their loved ones and where they are. That'll give us a sense as well. So as they tell their stories, we have to listen very, very carefully and practice our active listening skills.
Which I think is a great suggestion, having a piece of paper by you to just sort of take some notes and label some emotions you're hearing and things to circle back themes and all that. Dr. Pritchard, we lost your internet there for a moment. So whatever you were saying last, I'm sure it was a nugget of wisdom. So if you don't mind repeating it, if you remember what we were talking about at that point when it was.
I don't know exactly where it dropped, but I think just like what Spike was saying, the overarching message as you're connecting and talking about these things is, we want you to be safe.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
And then see where that goes.
Absolutely. And a lot of that for us is, in addition, but really connected with that, is that we want people to know they're not alone. That's especially in the pandemic when everything's so isolating, we want people to know they're not alone. So I think those kinds of questions, that they're all geared towards that, towards almost like an end goal of making sure you're safe and you're not alone. And what would, sometimes we get on the phone with folks and they're very emotional, they're really struggling. When we're with someone, we can sort of modify our breathing and our body language and see them sort of move along with us. Maybe if they're hyperventilating, you give them water and it causes them to take a breath, hold a breath, all that. And there are things that we can sort of help people with on a scene, but over the phone, you don't really have that. What would you suggest are ways to help, maybe some calming techniques that might be helpful for folks when they're really struggling over the phone?
Absolutely. The breathing we're just wired that way. Mm-hmm. Our breathing and our brain are very closely interconnected. Mm-hmm. And so if you can just teach people, let's slow this down a little bit. Can you slow that breath in and try to really let your lungs fill up? Mm-hmm. And then hold it a couple of seconds and then let it out nice and slow. Mm. And let's have you try that 6 times in a row. Mm-hmm. And let them try 6 breaths, intentionally trying to slow it down and really fill their lungs up. And then hold it a second when it gets full and then let it back out. What I try to tell people, an image that they can picture that they're probably familiar with, is we want you to breathe the exact opposite of the way a rabbit breathes. If you've ever watched a rabbit, it's shallow and it's quick. Uh-huh. They're always waiting for a hawk to come out of the sky, and so they're on alert. And so, we want to do the opposite of that, nice and slow and deep, and really fill those lungs up. Mm. Let it out nice and slow. And then about 6 times in a row is enough to try to get that rhythm changed a little bit. Other things like sensory stimulation can help. Sometimes splashing cold water on your face actually kind of just helps to ground you. It gives you kind of just a sensation for your brain to organize around.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
Sometimes movement helps
Mm.
some people. Let's get you moving.
Mm-hmm.
Getting that rhythm going with the body sometimes can help the brain to settle. So those are three kind of, sensation and movement and breathing
Mm.
are three, in addition to of course, inviting God into the situation in whatever way you might feel comfortable at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's wonderful. And a lot of times on scenes when people are, let's say for a homicide scene, for example, they're may feel a little defensive. They may feel very so. You can't always, uh, if you're on a natural death and you hold someone's hands and say, "Hey, let's take a deep breath together," then you probably have more luck with that than if you're on a homicide scene and they feel like you're trying to control them or whatever the dynamic that they're having with the incident that just happened. So, Spike, I don't know if you might comment. We talked about like the bottle of water. What are some ways that maybe we do on a scene, or maybe we could brainstorm on the phone that we, I don't want to say covertly, have them monitor their breathing or whichever. But what are some ways that we sort of might do accomplish the same goal, but in another way? I don't even know how to ask the question. Am I making sense?
Well, that's a good question. It's very difficult. I think you have to be very, very sensitive and aware as you listen to the clues they are giving in their pace, the vocabulary they're using. Are they speaking in complete sentences? And just try to, I think, to slow it down, just for us to speak in very short, direct sentences, simple sentences, and have our breathing be incorporated into that. I think can make a difference. But I think really just listening and paying attention as much as we can, because so much of what we're trained to do is to follow verbal cues and to be situationally aware of what all that's going on around them. So maybe we can ask them to describe where they are. What do you see?
Yeah.
What's it like? Is it raining where you are? I'd have extra umbrellas in the car for that. Those types of things. And that gets back to safety and well-being also. But I think get them, as John said, get them talking to share what's going on inside, but also around them as well. That may be a way of helping.
That's great. And I mean, you're helping them with some grounding techniques by maybe them talking about what they're sensing or seeing or smelling or hearing around them, or the pace of your conversation. And I think sometimes pauses too. And I know some folks that as soon as they say, I had a thought, everyone sort of stops and they sort of, so sometimes prompting something and pausing and developing that kind of, so we can't really do it visually to get a sympathetic kind of response, but maybe there are ways to accomplish that over the phone. And what would you all say are, so, and I'm mindful of our time as well. So, but what if we have to be mindful of our time on a call? And you've been speaking for a while, and now it's becoming more emotional, and it's time to wrap up the call. But it seems like the call is just starting on their end. Dr. Pritchett, what would you advise? How do we sort of handle that kind of dynamic when we might have to get off the phone, or we've been on the phone for quite a while, and that kind of thing? Any input on that?
Yeah, well, I would, when you're getting a sense that you need to start wrapping things up, but the person is still going through a lot, I think, first of all, like labeling that and saying, hey, I'm going to need to wrap up here in a few minutes, but I want to spend some time with you thinking about um, what do you have in your toolbox or in your resources that will
Mhm.
be helpful right now,
Mm.
and let them kind of go ahead and label what their resources are, whether that be people or activities or
Mm.
places or spiritual practices,
Mhm.
or go ahead and have them label those and identify them. And you're moving them kind of away from necessarily staying with the feelings and more into how are they in how are, how can they manage these,
Mm.
bring some
Yeah.
things together.
Yeah, that's very good. That's very, very helpful. Um, and we do find that a lot on scenes that we're trying to sort of help people move between the emotional and the cognitive and to, and it's an ebb and flow. Um, Sometimes we talk about scenes as being, you sort of be like a butterfly and go around the scene and just keep checking in, because there's that ebb and flow that happens with people, and you sort of build up a rhythm and people sort of become accustomed to it, but it gives them some breathing room. um, and I think on some of these calls we'll have that kind of thing, but it's important to be able to certainly at the end of the call be able to identify, hey, these are the things that are really important, and we want to make sure that we've touched base on them and bring them into some of the problem solving skills and that kind of thing. I found this really helpful, just to talk through it. Dr. Pritchett, if you don't mind, is there anything else that you would offer, like, or is there, one main thing that you think we should get out of every call, or what would be some sort of closing wisdom on for our chaplains as they're making these calls to survivors and folks in need?
The thing that's coming to me right now, Rich, is um, just the connectedness
Mm-hmm.
of what you all do. That you're coming to people at a time they may be feeling very disconnected,
Mm. Yeah.
and as you've made the connection, and then you're talking with them about how they can connect with things that are grounding and connecting for them, and then the expectation, I think, as you wrap up,
Mm-hmm.
um, if they have kind of I guess sometimes you all have a plan to have a further contact with them,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
but even more important probably with over the telephone rather than in person. uh, Important in person too, but over the phone, how will they connect if they have a future need? What,
Mm-hmm.
like an ongoing plan of that you can plant that seed, that this is um, not just a one-time thing necessarily, but something that if they have needs, they can reconnect, and what their plan would be about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's great. That's really good. Yeah. Spike, what would you say? What would be your sort of closing wisdom?
I love what Dr. Pritchett said about helping them think about what's in their toolkit. What kind of practices or things are available to them to help them cope to get through this difficult time.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that you remember that we have a sense of how scenes go,
Mm-hmm.
including the ebb and flow, but also when things get very, very emotional.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if there's been a homicide or a suicide, that moment when transport comes to take the body, that is very difficult. And if we have to get off a call before then, I think it's really important. They're not going to call us back in that moment, but us to anticipate how do we help them through that, and what would be best for them. Also,
Mm-hmm.
and this is something we do on scenes that are very long. We're a team. We don't do this by ourselves. And so we can communicate with the responders on the scene, or also get another chaplain involved on the phone if we need to. Just so I don't think we have to think in terms of the only thing we have to offer is ourselves, but to remember that we're part of a team, and our team is connected to other agencies that really do great work and have very caring people. And so I think that we need to be aware of that as we try to be present with people in their time of need, and to help them, get through those.
And one thought that comes to mind too is just the thought of a team and a process, and the toolkit as far as what are the days to come going to look like, and just for us as chaplains to recognize that we may be today may be just a small sliver of that process. So it may be a very awkward short phone call, but tomorrow may be a 20-second phone call, and the next day maybe 5 minutes. It could be that we're establishing relationship and people are going to take their time, or it may be that we're just going to send text messages and offer them resources that way. But just being open to the change of having been on scene and feeling like there's this packaged scene that we accomplish all this stuff, and in this sense, that whole interaction may be slivered over a week in little interactions that we have. So I think just being open to that kind of change is important. But back to what Dr. Pritchard said about connection, I think it really is the essence of what we are on a scene is providing hope and light in the midst of a dark situation and not knowing what the next day is going to look like. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's a lot of times it's knowing you're not alone that makes the difference. But we always say, and I always say this about Spike, I notice that is you'll see him on a scene, or you'll see him thinking you're talking through, all the gears are going. There's a lot happening. There's a lot of training and education that goes behind maybe the next 60 seconds of silence, right? Sometimes it's knowing just how to be present, or how to not say something, or how to ask the right question, that kind of thing. So I think all of this is really helpful for us in what we do, because we may just be listening on the phone, but there's a lot more that we're trying to be aware of to really help and care for people. So, well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Chaplain Spike and Dr. Pritchard. And we hope this will be a help to all our folks. I think it's a good idea to set up a little sheet that we could work through, or sort of have, not as a, oh, look at that, we've got a friend joining us.
That's the gear of the cat.
Oh, right. Perfect timing. I think she wants your attention now. Well, thank you all, and we appreciate it. Thanks for your help in helping us do what we do and serve the way we serve, and blessings on your work and mission and ministry that you do.
Well, thank you all for all you do for our whole community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Pritchard. Thank you, Rich.
Thank you.
Be safe. That seems to be the way we end a lot of interactions these days.
That's right. Be safe. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Well, bye-bye.
Bye.